Good evening. Delighted to see so many of you here this evening. Many old friends, many in the media, and many people for whom I guess this is the first Centre for Policy Studies event. For those of you who don't know us, we were set up by Margaret Thatcher, Chief Justice in 1974, to promote policies based on our founding principles: freedom, a small state, low tax, self-determination, and a strong nation state. Next year, we will be celebrating our 40th anniversary with what I hope will be a thrilling programme of events, as well as launching a new and revolutionary process which will drive our policy recommendations so that they have the greatest possible impact in this building here. And so there's never been a better time, if you believe in our principles, to sign up for membership at CPS. This event this evening is all the fault of my colleague Brian Paul. He saw a wonderful argument raging between our two protagonists on Coffee House, the Spectator blog, in which Peter said he would be happy to debate the subject any time, any place. Well, now is the time, here is the place, and we're very grateful to Douglas Murray and Peter Oborne for agreeing to come along this evening. But both of them hold such different, passionate views that shows the breadth of thinking and debate within the Conservative family. Finally, we're very grateful to our old friend Adam Holloway, the MP for Great British, who's chairing the debate. Adam's been both a captain in the British Army, serving in the First Gulf War, and also an investigative journalist with ITN, World in Action, Panorama, and the Sunday Times. Served on the Defence Committee for many years, and is a man of high principle, having resigned his PKS position in government over the European referendum. Last word, for those of you who are on Twitter, do follow the debate at our special hashtag CPS around debate. I wouldn't hope to keep the debate going there, but many thanks again.
Well, thank you all very much for coming. I won't introduce the speakers because you don't know who they are. You were inadvertently walked into the wrong room, I'd say. But the way we're going to play it is we're going to start off with an excellent CPS gimmick, and we'll have a show of hands on the motion, is the Iranian threat a dangerous delusion? We're then going to have 10 minutes for opening propositions, starting off with Peter. And I've agreed with both of them that the aim of the exercise this evening is to enlighten rather than entertain. So we're not going to have a sort of, Beano-style punch-up here. It's going to be a sensible discussion. So they'll talk for 10 minutes each. Then they'll have a 15-minute discussion between themselves, and then we'll throw it open to all of you. Because we've only got 15 minutes for that, if you could literally just say your name and any organisation you may represent, and please don't make a speech. If you want to make a point, make one, but really not more than 20 seconds. We're here to hear from them. We'll then have 5 minutes of closing speeches. Douglas will kick that off, and then we will have another vote to see whether anyone's changed their mind as a result of the forceful arguments that were being made. So, Ryan, do you want to coordinate the vote?
I'll count.
You'll count. Okay, so those in favour of the proposition, the Iranian threat is a dangerous delusion, those in favour of the motion, please put your hand up. Okay, thank you. Have you got that? Yeah? Yeah, and those against?
I think it's 2 to 1.
Okay, why don't you just give rough numbers?
30 to 50.
30 to 50. Good. Peter, would you like to kick off for 10 minutes, however many minutes you want?
Yeah. Let me know if I get beyond 10.
Sure.
Because it would be outrageous.
Speak loudly from that, there's no microphone.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me reasonably well? First of all, thank you very much to the Centre for Policy Studies for putting on this show. I've written for Tim Knox for many years now, and the CPS is a great ornament of our public life. And thank you also to Douglas Murray, who instantly and responded to an invitation, I understand, to debate this issue. Douglas, also, I have the highest admiration for his scrupulous debating and formidable, very unusual in this woebegone times to have such a fantastically learning and creative figure. Also, I'd also like to say how much I love to see Melanie Phillips, my old colleague from the Daily Mail, who we used to have very, very lively conversations in Daily Mail conferences. And doubtless those will not come to an end. The reason why David Morrison, my co-author, and I wanted to write this book was that we lived through, or I'll talk about myself, I lived through, and we all lived through in this room, the run-up to the Iraq invasion. And what happened there was the systematic deception of the British and other publics by government, and actually much more than government, by media. A series of falsehoods, many would say lies, were put before the public, and they led to the creation of the circumstances for what has been, and I think most people now agree with this, a catastrophe of the first order. What we've been seeing over the last few months, and I did notice this, is a very similar pattern of events. A media discourse and a government discourse which doesn't bear proper and accurate and scrupulous relationship with the underlying facts. What I wrote the book for, therefore, was to try and put a slightly different perspective. I'm not trying to deny that terrible things have happened in Iran. I'm not going to try and maintain that Iran is a great democracy. But what I am going to do is try and challenge what we call the desperate delusion that Iran is a country, a state, hell-bent on acquiring nuclear weapons and hell-bent on using those nuclear weapons against Israel. There is no evidence for either of those essential propositions. I'm then going to go on and challenge the proposition that you can't do business with Iran. I'm going to show that actually you can do business with Iran. In fact, the most difficult people to do business sometimes have been us. We have been, at the least, as difficult and as unreasonable as the Iranians. I'm then going to argue there's a deal on the table. Not by then, it'll take us 10 minutes, I imagine. So the first point is that it isn't something which you read very often, but there isn't an Iranian nuclear program. The Iranians are not building a nuclear weapon. It's not us, the authors, who say this. This is what US intelligence says. This appears to be in the annual national intelligence estimates. And this is, as President Obama stressed on his recent visit to Israel, there is really nothing to distinguish the US understanding from the Israeli understanding of that situation. So the US knows that there is not an Iranian nuclear program. The Iranians have not decided to build a bomb. It came as a great surprise when we went around to TV presenters and others, quite learned ones, quite distinguished ones, when we told them this, but that is the case. The second important point is that again and again, Iran sought to strike a deal on this and other issues with the United States. That trade is unreasonable, impossible to deal with, but again and again, after the Twin Towers, when fusion of emotional sympathy from Iran, from the mullahs, from these Islamist madmen, a profusion of sympathy. for the Americans after 9/11. Offers of assistance against the Taliban. Offers of deals. And biggest of those deals, most important, most comprehensive of those deals, was offered in 2005, when basically Iran offered the right to peaceful, the US should acknowledge, the West, I should say, should acknowledge, in those days it was the EU3, should acknowledge its right for peaceful enrichment, in return for which it would allow the world to gaze almost sort of without restriction on its nuclear facilities and other facilities. That deal was turned down by the West, appallingly so actually. It wasn't even considered, wasn't talked about. And the chief negotiator at that time was a gentleman called Rouhani. He's the president of Iran now. I think this is the most incredibly exciting moment in modern history, the Rouhani winning the presidency, because here you have a man who has a record of offering deals, who's sensible, reasonable, and at the very least we owe it to ourselves to talk to him and find out what is the colour of his money. But it is, one point is absolutely crucial. If we go on demanding Iran just gives up nuclear enrichment, we'll get nowhere at all. Iran has a right to peaceful nuclear enrichment under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's been a founder member of that treaty. It's broadly speaking been loyal to that treaty, and we have to acknowledge that Iran will expect to maintain peaceful nuclear enrichment, not military action. One final, how long have I been going there?
You've been going for 9 minutes.
Right. One final point. I think you need to bear in mind the history of Iran. How US and Britain sought to extinguish liberal democracy in 1953. Got rid of the Mossadegh government, and installed the Shah, his secret police, backed nuclear development under the Shah, changed its stance after 1979. We then largely backed the Iraqis in that terrible war of the 1980s. We have a terrible record with Iran. Why should they trust us? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to the Centre for Policy Studies. Thank you to Peter. Thank you to Adam for chairing. To begin by returning a compliment. In a somewhat tired, jaded, and often dull trade, Peter is an admirable voice of enthusiastic conflagration, anti-peacekeeping in the Conservative Party, and much more. And I admire him for that, and I'm sure share with you, among other things, admiration for his work on issues like, for instance, Zimbabwe, which I know your work, Centre for Policy Studies, you called for intervention in some years ago, and I admire you for that. But on the matter we've come to discuss tonight, I don't think there'll be very much agreement. You'll be amazed to hear. Peter finished by saying, why would the Iranians trust us? It's a legitimate question. A far more pressing one is, why would we trust them? This evening, by the way, came about because when Peter first published his book with David Morrison, I noticed in an interview with Telegraph that he and his co-author had done an interview where Peter's Telegraph colleague Con Cochrane, defence correspondent, described their book as, quote, delusional. And noticed that David Morrison, the co-author of Peter Oborne, said something very interesting. He said during that, he was asked a question, for example, about the unpleasantness of the regime in Tehran. The question is said, for example, they held a conference to discuss the historical veracity of the Holocaust, and Peter's co-author said, I'm not sure whether the conference actually said that. They did. It was attended by every Holocaust denier in the world, from Robert Forisson to Frederick Tobin, David Duke, the KKK. Peter's co-author went on to say, when the questioner said Holocaust deniers were present, he said, "You may be right indeed." But worse was to come. He said, Peter's co-author said, "I have never come across a statement from Ahmadinejad saying that the Holocaust didn't happen. He said other things that question the Holocaust and the numbers killed in the Holocaust, but I've never come across an absolute denial of it." So I immediately leapt in and pointed out that repeatedly, so many times that most of the time nobody bothered to report it, Ahmadinejad and the rest of the regime said exactly that. In Peter's own paper in 2009, Ahmadinejad was quoted saying, quote, "The Holocaust is a lie." This was not minimization of the Holocaust, denial of the Holocaust. And so I said that if this was a very serious error to make such a misrepresentation of the Iranian regime. And Peter very kindly responded by saying that his co-author had indeed been clumsy, had indeed been foolish, that he was inaccurate, and that he had not understood the facts. And I'm happy to say that that carries on throughout the book, which they've co-authored. And I would say there's a very serious set of questions over this work. And one of the problems, by the way, of being contrarian is that very often you get so used to walking against crowds that you walk against the wrong crowds, and you end up walking with very bad people indeed, and I submit that has now happened. Page 14 of Peter and David Morrison's book, they say, "We can see that it is indeed possible that the Iranians are secretly pursuing a nuclear bomb. However, we can show that there is no convincing evidence for this belief. Any Western politicians or propagandists who claims otherwise, they say, and there are plenty of them, is either ignorant of the facts or lying." Now, these are very strong words, and I'm not going to reply to them with anything other than open sources of what the UN body responsible for this has to say about the Iranian nuclear program. Let me start by talking about good faith and put a couple of questions, which I hope very much that Peter can answer, and I think it's incumbent upon him to do so. Firstly, if Iran is after nuclear energy for civilian purposes alone, why has it spent the last 30 years billions and billions of dollars and not produced to date 1 watt of electricity? Why is that? Secondly, most countries seeking a civilian program first build power plants, then get fuel supplies from abroad. They do not rely on indigenous fuel production. Why is Iran seeking the comprehensive capabilities, including indigenous fuel production, if they are not seeking to produce to weapons grade levels? Crucially, why the deceit? This President-elect Rouhani is at the center of this. He was nuclear negotiator for Iran from 2000 to 2005. He said in a speech before an Iranian religious conclave in 2010, quote, this is the new president, quote, "While we held talks, we were installing our first centrifuges. While we negotiated in 2002, we went from 0 to 700, end quote." During the election campaign that's just finished, the same president-elect now, Rouhani, boasted of how during his tenure as the Iranian nuclear negotiator, Iran did not suspend enrichment, but on the contrary, quote, "we completed the program," end quote. On the matter of good faith, if Iran is indeed showing good faith, why the secret facilities? Why the secret facilities? Why the secret facility built into the side of a mountain at Fordo? Why the secret plutonium enrichment at Arak? Why the plutonium enrichment plant? Why the systematic blocking to international inspectors of the plant at Parchin? Why has that been done? Now, in 2008, the IAEA asked why Iran was producing enriched uranium metal hemispheres. These are not things with very many uses other than for a nuclear bomb. It is conceivable the Iranians want two uranium metal hemispheres to make a particularly great golf ball, but I never heard anyone who thought so. Iran, point 3, is where it is today, not because of an international conspiracy led by Israel or Britain or the US, but because of the UN agency responsible for these matters. I am not quoting some kind of secret intelligence source. I am quoting, about to quote, the IAEA. The Security Council of the United Nations has passed 6 resolutions today, 5 of them unanimously, finding Iran, the Iranians, to be in non-compliance. The Security Council has ordered the Iranians on these 6 occasions to immediately suspend all enrichment-related activities. They have not. Since 2008, the IAEA has issued quarterly reports on Iran, with a whole section on, quote, possible military dimensions to the Iranian nuclear project. That puts Iran in a very unique club for these quarterly reports, sharing the space with North Korea. The latest IAEA report from May 2012 concluded in section 8 of the possible military dimensions, quote, this is the IAEA, since 2002, the agency has become increasingly concerned about the possible existence in Iran of undisclosed nuclear-related activities involving military-related organizations, including activities related to the development of a nuclear payload for a missile. Iran has dismissed the agency's concerns. To quote from the latest of the IAEA's report, section L, the summary, quote, Iran is not providing the necessary cooperation. Point L, summary, point 69. Despite the intensified dialogue between the agency and Iran since January 2012 in 10 rounds of talks, it has not been possible to reach agreement on the structured approach document, given the nature and extent of credible information available to the agency about possible military dimensions to Iran's nuclear program. The agency considers it essential and urgent for Iran to engage with it on the substance of the agency's concerns. Now, on page 67 of their book, Peter and David Morrison have an absolutely astonishing passage. They say, page 91 to 92, sorry, page 91 to 92. They said, the US has special forces deployed in 75 countries. And in August 2011, the Pentagon said that this number was likely to go up to 120. This is part of an attempt to build a case that America in particular, I think it's a safe interpretation, that America in particular is a sort of global aggressor of some kind. In August 2011, the Pentagon said this number was likely to go up to 120. That is 60% of the states in the world. Continuing the quote, Iran is believed to have forces in Syria and Lebanon. I would submit there is something very suspicious going on there. If you say that America is in 60% of the world's countries, but Iran is merely believed to be in Syria and Lebanon, ladies and gentlemen, no international agency, nobody I know, nobody in Syria or Lebanon thinks that Iran is not currently involved in Syria and Lebanon. The Syrian people being at this very moment gunned down by the Hezbollah militias, the proxies of Iran, would beg to differ about the believed bit of that question. Now, as I said at the outset, the problem seems to me an assumption by Peter and his co-author of good intent by the Iranian regime and bad intent from everyone else. And that has a consequence. And it is a consequence that they go on to talk about on page 92 of their book. The consequence, they say, and this is a quote, there is little question that all 3 countries, the United States, Israel, and Britain, should be expelled from the United Nations. If you are to assume only good intent of the Iranian regime and believe that Britain, Israel and the United States should be expelled from the UN, you have, I submit, gone down a very dangerous path to a very fevered swamp. Finally, there is a school of thought which we've heard a lot of in recent years, which suggests that really the president of Iran doesn't matter terribly much. Ahmadinejad was a bit of an embarrassment. He said all these awful, wacky things, and everyone really finds it awful and embarrassing and so on. In which case, those same people who thought that, would I submit, have to think the same thing of this alleged reformer / nuclear negotiator President-elect Rouhani. However, if we are to take that claim of theirs at face value, let us please, and before I finish, this will be the last point I'll make, let us please remember where power does undeniably lie in Iran, and that is with the supreme leader. I have not talked about Israel tonight, but I won't finish without making mention of this. This is not Ahmadinejad, this is the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, speaking in 2001, quote, "It is the mission of the Islamic Republic of Iran to erase Israel from the map of the region." The next year, incidentally, and I spoke to one of the people who was in the room when he said this just recently, one of the Spanish negotiators, who told me firsthand the story of having breakfast with the supreme leader just 10 years ago. And they went in, they were in Tehran, the Spanish delegation were invited by the Supreme Leader's office to have breakfast, interestingly enough. And they accepted it. The Supreme Leader asked you to come to breakfast and we're in Tehran, you should probably go to breakfast. And they went in and there were a very strange scene of singing clerics behind the Supreme Leader as he ate his breakfast. And they had a translator, and the Spanish negotiator told me that they wanted to break the ice. And so he said to the Supreme Leader, as you all know, and Peter knows, everyone looks at this notes, there was a slightly complex power structure underneath the supreme leader in Iran. So the Spanish delegation decided to open with this and said to the supreme leader, to the translator, "What is your job?" And the reply that came back from the supreme leader was, "My job is to put Israel on fire." I think, ladies and gentlemen, it is not a delusion to listen to the words of the Iranian regime and to take them at their face value. I do not think it is a delusion to think that there is something more than something peaceable going on in Iran and in its nuclear reactors. And I do not think, and think it would be a very, very great mistake for you to think, ladies and gentlemen, that in this whole survey of the situation in the globe at the moment, the aggressors, the ones who should be thrown out of the UN, is this country, America and Israel. And that Iran is some poor, benighted power led by misunderstood people with only good intent. Thank you.
So we'll now have 15 minutes of discussion between the two speakers, and I think we'll kick off. If you'd like to put those questions that you raised earlier in your speech about the nuclear program.
Yeah. Well, I suppose I'll reiterate that.
I could just sort of state it, if I misstate it, you just let me know. So the first one, if Iran is after nuclear energy for civilian purposes, it has not produced a single what's going on. Yeah? Well, one of the problems which Iran has faced now is that it gets bombed or it's constantly getting bombed or sabotaged. During the Iraq War, it was bombed. It's now subject to cyber attack, which would be an act of war, actually. It was done to the US, I believe it was an act of war, but that's just... And so it's very, and of course, during the 90s, after the 1979, all cooperation was withdrawn from Iran, so it wasn't able to get nuclear installation material from the international market. So there's a very good reason. So for 30 years, there has been, ever since 1979, it has been operating in an impossible situation. I suggest, by the way, that if you were to treat Iran like a normal civilized power that legitimate claim to be an independent nation, these problems would vanish. Then second, it causes lots also on indigenous production of nuclear materials. How can you trust the international community because it's constantly under attack. It can't rely on its neighbours. It can't. It's perfectly reasonable for Iran to behave in the way it does. Third one, can you come back to me on the third question? It's a quote from Rouhani.
Yes, others. Why the secret facilities? Why the subterfuge? Why the plutonium enrichment of Iraq? Why the secret facility at Fordo?
Yeah.
Why the non-access to Parchin, and so on.
Right, to deal with those. By the way, I mean, quite a lot. I'm very happy to accept that I wish Iran to cooperate with the international community now, and I hope very much that now there is a new president and a new approach, and if we start to talk to Iran rather than threatening Iran, we might get a much easier and better situation. So I think this can be a marvelous moment when Iran does start to cooperate. That said, you read out that stuff from the IAEA report. I challenge a word of it. And on the other hand, looking at the issue of Parchin, it's important to bear in mind that Parchin was open to inspection when Rouhani was the chief negotiator, when the talks were going on. I think it would become open to inspection again. Let's bear in mind that Parchin is basically a military complex. And the idea that Britain allow international inspectors, or the United States, let alone Israel, to sort of go and have a sort of poke around you, is just, you are demanding a special situation for the Iranians, and so I think that explains quite a lot of the reasons why they did. Why the secret facilities? Well, Iran, as you know, were challenged that they were secret. What they say, and I think they've got international law on their side, so say Fordo, that there is an obligation to declare nuclear materials. But Fordo only just been building the plant, because I think is when it was exposed. Nevertheless, I agree with you. I wish they hadn't kept it secret. But that is that they weren't in breach of the legal situation as set out by the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that is what they insist. And I think they have some justice on that side.
Could I very quickly respond to a couple of those points? Firstly, again, just using the IAEA's latest report on this about the facility at Parchin, which was kept secret, as I say, when it was finally discovered. This is what the IAEA had to say about some activity there. This is section H, paragraphs 55 and 56 of the latest IAEA report. Since the Director General's previous report, Iran has conducted further spreading, levelling and compacting of material over most of the site of Parchin, a significant proportion of which it is also asphalted. There have also been indications of activity within the chamber building. This is during a period in which nothing is meant to be going on with this facility. Paragraph 56. As previously reported, Iran has stated that the allegation of nuclear activities at the Parchin site is, quote, baseless, and that, quote, the recent activities claimed to be conducted in the vicinity of the location of interest to the agency has nothing to do with specified location by the agency. Iran's explanation, this is the IAEA, Iran's explanation for the soil displacement by trucks is that it was, quote, due to constructing a new road at Parchin. Now, there is, again, very legitimate reason the IAEA not to believe that a facility that Iran was pretending didn't exist is now not operating with their trucks going to and fro, maybe not trusting the word of the Iranians when they say that actually they aren't doing anything with a reactor there, but building a new road. Now, this is part of, I would say this is part of a consistent project. You can agree with Peter that they have the legal right to develop secret enrichment facilities and to continue to develop parts of their nuclear project in secret, and that is not only their right, but their legal right. But I would beg to differ.
Now, can I just come back to you on 2 points? So first, will you allow me to observe, you do quote the IAEA report very selectively. And you haven't drawn you've used it very extensively. You haven't drawn the people in this room's attention to the most important finding of all, namely number C, which is the agency continues to verify the non-diversion of declared material, nuclear material at these facilities. Now, so the key point is that there's no nuclear material that has been diverted according to the IAEA. There's a second point where you ask people, well, as if I'm some sort of madman, to agree with me that there is no special project. But let's just get this straight in the room, and it's very important. Actually, it's not just me, it's the US intelligence agencies. He invited you to agree, which I agree, who agree with me. I think actually Israeli intelligence, it's not so clear, but I think they agree with me. But certainly US intelligence agrees with me that there is no price, it's so important this, that there is no mission, there is no project to build a nuclear bomb going on in Iran at the moment. And there is certainly, I completely accept what they're saying. I want them to be open about what's happening at Parchin. I think if we start to be sensible with Iran and started talking to them, and Madrid, particularly the Congress, imposed sanctions, such regime, except putting them under, treated them like an ordinary, as much as possible, like an ordinary country, we would soon find them cooperating on Parchin and many other matters. And could I ask you a question? Where do you think this is leading upwards? This regime of sanctions and of threats and refusing to talk to them, saying you're not allowed your rights under the NPT for nuclear enrichment. Where does it go? Because I can't see where it leads, apart from to the abject humiliation of that regime, and that's not going to happen because they're not going to give in.
The answer, there's 2 points. Firstly, the National Intelligence Desk of the US government from 2007. This is a highly contested document, as you well know. It is used you said selectively, very selectively, if at the same time lubriciously in your book. The 2007 NIE estimate was immediately wrote back on by members of, among other things, the intelligence community in the US. In February 2008, the NIE director himself, Michael McConnell, said to the Senate Select Committee that if he said, quote, "If I had till now to think about it, I would change a few things." He went on to add, "I would change the way we describe the Iranian nuclear program," which is the very thing in your book you say is the crux of the alleged American unwillingness to go down a route that you allege that others are trying to push them down. There is, and I grant you this, and I should have mentioned this like there is a plurality of opinion in Washington and across intelligence agencies of the world, including, in my understanding, among the Israelis, about what the plans of various people in the administration, the regime, one should say, in Iran, actually are. There are undoubtedly hardline members of the regime who would like to break out tomorrow. There are others who recognize that that would bring them all sorts of problems, including even further and even more stringent international sanctions. There is, and this is, as I said, recognized by everyone, the plurality of opinion within the regime. And that is why there is a plurality of opinion outside of people looking into the regime. Precisely because people realize that there are certainly elements in the Iranian regime which are not just highly unstable, but messianic, end-timers, and much more. And that there are those who are also pragmatists and who are simply, as they say, riding the tiger in the knowledge that if they come off, they get eaten. Of course, this is the case. But as I say, since 2007, an IE report, much of the intelligence establishment in Washington has no back foot. Certainly, very briefly, family. Very briefly. You ask where this is heading. Well, there are those who say that, for instance, the election of this alleged reform Rouhani will bring a sort of entire change in the way in which Iran responds to the world and the way in which the world responds to Iran. I think that's very misguided. And again, I referred to him in my opening remarks, but the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, isn't currently sadly going anywhere, and is not himself a mode, it would seem, somebody with whom I would advocate that we can do business. Now, where might this end? I would suggest that it ended in something like the following situation. I personally, this is my personal view, I would very much like to see the end of the regime in Iran. And I would like to make sure the mullahs are not in charge of very much longer to oppress that country. And I would like to think that people like those students who stood up on their streets in 2009 and tried to overthrow that regime, and who were shot and who were thrown off buildings and tortured and raped and all of that, the government facilities, by the government's agencies, by all of the Iranian bureaucracy and terror, were someday soon, I hope, able to get their country back from this gang who have taken it from them since 1979. And a final point I made on that. It seems to me that if at some future state Iran entered what I think we both hope it will enter at some point of the normal comity of nations, it will be not when it is run by the revolutionary regime that has been installed in power since it grabbed the revolution in 1979, but by something far more like the normal regimes which one can do business with in the region. Certainly, however, the very worst idea of all is to have this regime standing always, teetering always on the brink of breakout capability in order at some point to have a nuclear weapon.
I think this is an extraordinarily important statement we've had here from Douglas Murray, because what he has said is that his real intention, the real thing which concerns him, is regime change. He also accepts that me and the intelligence community are right about agreeing with each other about the fact that there is no ongoing current project to build a bomb. But a key point here making now that you can't do business with the current regime. Regime change is what you have to have. Now, I think we've really got to lock that in to our heads, because I'm saying that even if that was desirable, it's, I believe, a hopeless enterprise. If we set about achieving it, I think we would drive Iran into international isolation, and ultimately we would cause them to get the bomb. And I think that one of the problems we have here is that the ambition of Douglas and his ilk is not as apparent as that. You say you're concerned about the bomb. What you really want is regime change. And just to bring one piece of evidence to this, it's in George W. Bush's book, Decision Points, published, I think, in 2010. He describes how he got this in 2007. He received the NIE Intelligence Estimates report, which comes from the 16 intelligence agencies, and it said, we are pretty well certain, not really certain, that there is they're not building a bomb. And Bush's reaction is so interesting. He records in his book, not that he was pleased, you thought he'd be delighted to learn that the central objective of the George W. Bush administration had been secured, that he had managed to get the Iranians to abandon their plans to build a bomb. You thought this was really a glorious moment in George W. Bush's history, but no, it wasn't. He was angry. He was angry, he said, because it took the military option off the table. That's what he did. So that's what the real objective, Bush is there admitting that his real objective was military action against Iran, and he was angry when he learnt that Iran did not have plans to build a bomb.
Do you want to come very briefly, then we're going to get to questions.
So may I ask, if President Bush was so keen for cabinet action, why didn't he do it?
I was kidding. He thought it was because he was being undermined by his intelligence agencies. That's what he says in the book.
But can I just give the starting point about the regime? Because Peter, you just said that if there was a change of regime, it would isolate Iran in the world.
I said that if we take your line, which is absolutely honest, it's total, as always with you, Douglas, full of integrity, that you will not talk to the men who run Iran. We will not deal with them. No, we will not allow them to play their full role in the international community until you've had regime change, got a liberal Democrat government acceptable to Washington and to London, operating inside Tehran, and that will drive them into that will drive them into isolation. What I'm saying is that we have to accept that the Islamic Republic of Iran exists. It's likely to continue to exist. It's a legitimate political entity, and we don't treat it as such. We risk something terrible.
Just very quickly. I didn't say we don't talk to Iran. I'm all for talking. I want everyone to talk to everyone. And anyone who studies this, as you have, knows that everyone does talk to everyone. There is not some loss of talk going on. What I am saying, and what I think I've been very clear in saying, is not that we don't talk or that no one talks to Iran, but that this regime is not allowed to continue to pull the wool over the eyes of the international community, and crucially, is not allowed to develop a weaponized capability for nuclear arms. And very, very briefly, if I may, the regime is not going to necessarily be in place for years. We are seeing across that whole region regimes which you and others have said would be in place for many times, falling by the month, being pressured by the month. Just one fact I'll bring to your attention, isn't it? A few months back in Tehran, there were protests by students and others saying, because of course the arming of Hezbollah and Assad's regime in Damascus, saying, why are you arming the Syrians whilst we are starving? That doesn't sound to me like a regime which is necessarily going to be embedded for the duration of our adult lives. I hope it will not be, and I hope that Peter would join me in that hope.
Okay, now we've got 15 minutes of questions. Catherine will really make the questions snappy and also the answers, because that way we can make the most of 15 minutes. The gentleman with the CPS membership that he's filled in.
I was a bit surprised.
You can say who you are in any organisation you represent.
Dr. Abbott and lecturer in international law. I was quite surprised at Candice Murray saying normal regimes in the area should have nuclear capability, or when Iran gets to that level. I did a study of which of the two states, Venezuela or Sweden, were more likely to comply with international law. The answer being Sweden, because it has the rule of law inviolable, as private property rights, equal and frequent variety in its domestic arrangements. Iran, or none of the other regional entities, have such domestic institutions which prevent those things, and therefore they're unlikely to comply with international rules. My question is, are we more likely to get an Iran or another state which could have nuclear capabilities through international sanctions, or do we need a far more effective system of civic participation to create the rule of law in those countries that would allow a range down which nuclear capability could be allowed in international agreement?
Great question. That's an example there of what we want to avoid. Much shorter questions.
I know exactly.
Let's just answer the individual.
Very briefly, yes, as I say, the two separate things: the nature of the regime, the legitimacy of the regime, and then the weaponry or projects of a nuclear kind that it might be able to pursue. And my own belief, as I say, is that the worst type of a regime, even suspected of pursuing the worst type of weaponry, is a combination that we in the world would not wish to see.
Well, I think one should just say very briefly in response to you, but Iran has terrible elements, breaches human rights and so forth, but I wouldn't be completely contemptuous the way it works. There is a rule of law, it's an interesting experiment in merging, one could say, Islamic and Western norms. And so I think there is a danger, sir, in trying to define countries which don't operate in Europe or along strictly European lines. So,
Douglas, I feel it's extremely unfortunate that you started your speech by invoking the memory of the Holocaust, the worst crime in human history, because the Iranians are not responsible for the Holocaust. It's civilized Europeans, like the Germans, the Austrians, they were responsible for the Holocaust. So I think people like you are trying to demonize an entire group of human beings by trying to accuse them of attempting to start a second Holocaust.
Forgive me, sir, these are questions.
Yeah, well, can you respond to that?
Yeah, it's not hard to. I don't think at any point I announced that the Iranians were responsible for the European Holocaust. If I did, please forgive me. It was a stumble which I can't imagine why it came out of my mouth. But I don't think I did say that. What I said was that at a conference in Tehran organized by the president of Iran, they assembled every known international Holocaust denier. Did I not say that?
No, you did, but
Right, okay, good.
it's like you're not accusing them of the second Holocaust. Would they wish that?
Well, I do think that there was a legitimate concern
when a regime that has organized conferences denying that the Holocaust of European Jewry occurred then says that they want to wipe the Jewish state off the map. I do think that's a concern, and I do think one ought to cite A if one then talks about B.
Ryan Bourne, PCKS.
My question for you is, Peter, if Iran has no intent of developing a nuclear weapon to use against Israel, what are we to make of these statements that Douglas Murray has invoked? Are the Iranian leaders invoking these statements because they see the Iranian people as longing for this sort of rhetoric, or what is the intention of the Iranian leaders in using this sort of anti-Israeli rhetoric?
Yeah, well, I think it's very hard to read intentions. It's a terrible sort of mistake not to read. The many domestic audiences, probably international audiences. I don't want to. What I do want to certainly do is deprecate, say how absolutely disgusting some of these remarks have been, and also to stress that this is a hopeful thing. President Ahmadinejad is no longer in power, and I think in general that the Iranian regime. I've got a very good quote, from Ehud Barak last year, the former defense minister in Israel. I don't think the Iranians, even if they got the bomb, would drop it in the neighborhood. They fully understand what would follow. What might follow. They are radical but not totally crazy. They have a quite sophisticated decision-making process and they understand reality. Now that's Ehud Barak. He's a tough guy, Ehud Barak. I think it's very important what he says there, that despite these, Douglas Murray is quite right to draw attention to these appalling remarks, but I think that it is a much more rational political system. Not according to me, according to Ehud Barak.
Richard Sharp, yes. What we've got here is unusual in that we have two protagonists broadly agreeing on facts, but with confirmation bias for each of them, putting them in opposite directions. If there's a mistake on one side, it would be which would have catastrophic consequences would be on Peter's side. Given that there are these issues, which is Iran's rhetoric, the way they're pursuing the singular approach to energy, and the fact that they conduct hostile actions and against the neighbors. And you've got the thesis, which is actually their self-interest to do all these things. What would they need to do for you to look at the facts that you then see to change your mind, Peter?
Well, I hope that I'm simply being sceptical today, saying don't believe everything you read, don't believe everything you hear. And I think I'm also hopeful, saying give real negotiations a chance and realize that essentially the peaceful negotiation. What would happen to break my mind? Because that's a very reasonable question. If there was clear evidence that Iran had deceitfully moved nuclear materials from under the eyes, hidden a nuclear bomb or a nuclear device from the IAEA. They could easily see, and that was proof of that. But I do look for proof. I think it is so dangerous, a lot of the public discourse here. You get a lot of stuff in the newspapers which you get inspired by mysterious places. And if you had proof that they were building a bomb, I would change my mind. I would accept that was the case.
Very good. That is a pretty extraordinary place to put your bar, that if Iran already owned a nuclear bomb and was found to be hiding one, because of course, you said if they'd hidden a nuclear device.
I'll give an example. I say nuclear bits, but
okay, right. So I wasn't actually quoting what you said as being what you said. You said if they
secretly, of course I changed my mind.
right, but don't you think, as I do, that might be too late?
Okay, gentlemen, white back again. We haven't got much time, so snappy questions and snappy answers. White, gentlemen, white behind you.
From the Financial Times. Two questions, Dr. Murray. What do you think of Twitter Pass's forensic demolition of the case that the United States is in any way serious about negotiations with Iran? And are you aware of just how similar your rhetorical devices are to those that took us into the invasion of Iraq in 2003. I mean, I closed my eyes and I hear Colin Powell in February 2003 talking about sword displacing by trucks, as if that's some evidence that that Iran is such a dangerous threat to us all. We've been here before, and that's why selling this case to the public is going to be impossible.
Yes, by what friends? Okay, so you're a journalist, so you should be able to listen to the facts. And the facts I cited were not Colin Howell talking about trucks. The facts I cited, and I said this at the outset, were solely those of the UN agency responsible for inspecting these sites, and which, time and again for some years now, have been surprised to discover the regime in Iran continues to be revealed, to be hiding its facilities, to be subverting and getting around inspections which the UN expects to be seen having being respected. I mean, I think that. And as for the claim that we've heard this before, well, I suppose Colin Howell will speak for himself. My own view is simply that if you decide that because of what was said in the Iraq War, there are no bad regimes in the world seeking to desire bad weaponry, then we'll get there to Armageddon pretty fast.
Gentleman in the blue suit, front row here.
Yes. Alec Nakamura, do you believe that the recent elections in Iran likely to change their stance on the civil conflict?
Well, Gay Douglas, I said that the supreme leader is the man who makes the final decisions. I don't dissent from that at all. On the other hand, I do think Mr. Rouhani is a wonderfully hopeful moment. I am very struck that he was the chief negotiator when Iran put the deal on the table, which the British ambassador of the Atomic Energy Authority, Peter Jenkins, said was a terrible missed opportunity. In retrospect, he said it was a terrible missed opportunity. If we had accepted that deal offered by Rouhani in 2005, we would probably be in a very good place now. We wouldn't be talking about running Iran. And so I think that it is a wonderful moment.
I'm not as confident as Peter as chief negotiator on Iran's safety projects, who most about, as cited earlier, pulling all those guys did have to be a focal moment. Nor do I think it's going to lead to much of a change. In January of this year, just a few months ago, Mr. Rouhani, now President-elect of Iran, said, quote, backing the pro-Assad policy of the Iranian regime, quote, in January, Syria has constantly been on the front line of fighting Zionism, and this resistance must not be weakened. There's your reform, Peter.
Slight follow-up on that.
Louder.
Do you think President Rouhani could be the next Gorbachev?
I think you're widening the question, Jenny, to sort of political. Gorbachev led Soviet Russia to its present chaotic state. But I think that in the sense that Maggie Thatcher said, he's somebody we can do business with, in that sense, yes.
I'm the no.
Melanie. Peter expressed over and over again that you feel good faith from Iran and that we should treat it as an ordinary country. And much of the problem is Iran does not need treated as an ordinary country, just like Britain or America. In an ordinary country entitled to peaceful nuclear development. I wonder why, therefore, you make absolutely no mention of Iran's sustained involvement in terrorism against America and Britain and the West. It declared war against the West in 1979. It has sustained acts of terrorism against American facilities. Its regime has been made by the Argentine prosecutor, has helped organize a similar squad in wilderness areas in which 86 people died and 300 were injured in 1994. What would it take you, Peter, to persuade you that Iran was not an ordinary outfit, it was a principal and premier terrorist regime in the world?
Can I didn't anywhere say we should assume good faith in Iran. I certainly don't think we should do that. Of course, we should be intensely suspicious of everything they say and do. What I said was something different, which was that they need to be treated as a legitimate power with legitimate interests in the Middle East. That's a different, and above all, we need to acknowledge that as a member of the I will answer your questions very precisely. As a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, they have a right to have peaceful nuclear enrichment. Indeed, we have a duty at the NBT to help. So that is what I said. Now, there are a number of answers to the specific. The Argentinian thing is extremely unique. There are all kinds of potential. It's a terrible, terrible event, utterly unspeakable event. But there are all kinds of potential perpetrators of that desperate act. I mean, again, we can, and one of them might have been Iran. I'm not convinced that it was. I'm sorry. And there are a number of other. Iran is accused of all kinds of things abroad, and I'm always very suspicious. We have to realise that we are in a media environment which bears interesting similarities to pre-2003. It's ordinary crackpot nation. They're trying, some of the Iranian government trying to assassinate through the means of some used car dealer, some American. The Saudi ambassador in the United States the other day. There's a lot of stuff which is very, very suspect. If you want to know who sponsors international terrorism, by the way, Saudi Arabia. Yeah. And I asked the policeman about the streets of London. I said, has there ever been an Iranian or a Shia bomb planned or carried out onto the streets of London? Never. Only Wahhabi extremists do this. Only Al-Qaeda does it. International terrorism sponsored by our close ally, who I very rarely hear you or Douglas Murray criticise, Saudi Arabia.
You don't listen enough.
Right. Well, the issue is international. The leading sponsor, Al-Qaeda, Qatar, Saudi. And Qatar and Al-Qaeda has, normally on its press releases, death to the Persians. And so if we want, and so I do not accept wordplay.
That's one second.
Well, it's very hard to understand. The Argentinian authorities believe Hezbollah carried out that attack as a proxy for the Iranians. The bombing of a bus in Bulgaria last year, in which among others, bus driver, a European citizen, was killed, was pointed by the Bulgarian authorities as being a Hezbollah attack. The people just finished coming to trial in Cyprus in recent weeks for trying to plot and find attacks in Europe which Hezbollah could carry out. I have never, I think, successfully or otherwise been accused of being weak on Saudi or Wahhabi-inspired terrorism, so it's a novelty. But I think that one can be critical of Wahhabi and Saudi-inspired terrorism at the same time as deprecating the same stuff when it comes to Iran and its proxies, which have operated in Europe, which did so last year. A trial has just finished in Cyprus. That's not nothing.
Thank you. The gentleman next to the lady in the beautiful pink dress. Yeah, you, sir. Yeah.
A very brief question. Where do they get the centrifuges?
Say it again.
It's all about centrifuges that I've been hearing. All this how many they got, how many they're going to get, when they're going to get enough to, and the nuclear program that works. But where do they get the centrifuges?
The level of technical knowledge I can't.
Does anybody?
Some of it is Pakistan. They sold a number that were actually second-hand from the COM network. Among others, they thought they were buying brand new reactors. Actually, they're second-hand. There have been a whole set of problems. I mean, it is not as easy as it was, for instance, when Monsieur Chirac sold the nuclear reactor to Saddam Hussein, and Saddam Hussein famously said, well, of course we paid twice for it from the French. Who else was going to sell us a nuclear reactor? Things have changed a little since then. It's still quite hard to get hold of them, but there has been an amazing amount of help, among other places, from networks in Pakistan and elsewhere. And the problem of proliferation in the region, by the way, just very quickly, neither of us have talked about this. The problem of proliferation in the region after and because of Iran is very significant. That we already know. We know from another antagonist of mine, Julian Assange, in WikiLeaks. We know that Saudi Arabia, among other countries, are waiting and are on the threshold of buying nukes, as it were, off the shelf, the moment that the Iranians seem to be at the point and the threshold of nuclear capability. What we see then, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, as I'm sure you know, is the most dangerous and precarious region in the world, armed to the teeth with genocidal weaponry. And that, if I had one aim, is the thing I want to avoid.
Right, so anybody can answer that, because I think anybody who who believes that should also read. I don't claim to have total knowledge of anything, but also Jack Straw on the floor of the House, the former British Foreign Secretary on the floor of the House a couple of weeks ago, who said that the risk of signing, explain why, the risk of signing getting a bomb, if Iran did, heaven forfend, we really don't want it to, is much overestimated.
Okay, we're over time, but just very quick question, very quick answer, please.
At what stage would you advocate military intervention?
David?
I wouldn't draw my line anyway. I think it's very wise to draw red lines. I think that, for instance, Benjamin Netanyahu who drew a very clear red line at the UN recently. I think the red line drawing is not wise. It's not particularly wise of statesmen. It's far, far less wise of pundits. I would simply observe that at any stage where it looked like they could have breakout capability, for instance, would be enough for me. I think that the moment at which Peter's, as it were, hidden nuclear device is in place is a moment at which you can do nothing, because at that point, once they're nuclear armed, this country and no other country on earth is going to do anything to intervene. And that's the thing with rulers to know most. Once they've got the bomb, they will really be in place for the duration.
By the way, this trope of yours, this rhetorical device, Peter's hidden rhetorical. You're brilliant, by the way. I mean, you are the best rhetorician.
You said it, Peter.
But that's not my
you said.
What I said was that we cannot know for certain. Of course, we can't prove that Brazil doesn't have a hidden nuke. We cannot prove it. But what we can do is draw attention to statesmen, people in position. James Clapper, for instance, Director of US Intelligence, says we know pretty damn well, we can watch what's going on in Iran, and we know that they haven't diverted nuclear material. And so what you are doing, brilliant, congratulations, is saying because we don't know, we can't prove they haven't got a bomb, we have a bomb. And I think we need a rational discussion. We need a rational discussion. And what that is what you haven't been providing as much as I expected in tonight's debate. Good night.
Okay, now we thank you for the question. We've now got 5 minutes each for closing speeches, and we'll start with Douglas.
Well, thank you. I can't help being amazed that Peter pretending it's a rhetorical device of mine that the words came out of his mouth, or the words came out of his mouth, but he didn't say that. He said that his threshold would be of unacceptability would be if there was a hidden nuclear device in Iran. And that seems to me, as I stressed several times now, not only to be the words that came out of his mouth, but a threshold which I think would be intolerable. You just quoted, by the way, the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper. Perhaps I can summarize the key points he made in testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee yesterday, where he told lawmakers that Iran's technical advancement, particularly in uranium enrichment, strengthens our assessment that Iran has the scientific, technical, and industrial capacity to eventually produce nuclear weapons. Thank you for reminding me to cite Mr. Clapper. I think, in summary, ladies and gentlemen, without intruding on your time any longer, I would just say this. Peter's book, co-written with Dave Morrison, is something that in a way is worth reading, because it's important to see a situation in which bad faith is routinely expected and directed against this country and against our allies. As I say, I repeat, a book that says that Britain and America should be thrown out of the UN.
I didn't say that.
You do say it. You say it on page 92 of your book. Okay, if the words that come out of your mouth aren't the words that come out of your mouth and the words you've written in your book, I don't know, maybe Mr. Morrison wrote that bit. But that's on page 92. Anyhow, that Britain and America should be thrown out of the United Nations seems to me at the same time as not wanting. And I'm sorry you said it now that you don't. You just said now we should be intensely suspicious of everything they do. You don't show that level of even remote suspicion in your book. In any of the statements in your book, there is not even an iota of, quote, intense suspicion. No. The intense suspicion is on this country, on the intelligence community of the US, on the intelligence agencies of the Western world, on the governments of the Western world. I appreciate, Peter, that there are people who are very, very sore about the war in Iraq, who feel all sorts of things about it, and you are right to express skepticism. That is absolutely, among other things, the job of people in our trade. Yes, expressing skepticism. But to express skepticism about this country and our allies, and almost none
of Iran is extraordinary. What they say, finally, what they say and what they do, those are the only two things you can judge Iran, the regime in Iran, or any other power on. What they say and what they do. If you want to see what they say, I've got plenty of the photos of the demonstrations in the center of Tehran, where it says on the side of Shahab missiles, Israel should be wiped off the face of the world. That's what they said. It's been said by every single leader in Iran since the catastrophic revolution of 1979. It's been said by all of them. It's been said by your moderate. What they do, come on. You can't pretend that Hezbollah and the terror proxies of Iran are not what they are. Ladies and gentlemen, what you are being asked to do is to express the most wild skepticism of truths which are being gone over by the IAEA and other international bodies. And you are being asked to express, contrary to the statement just made in this book, express almost no skepticism whatsoever about a regime which murders and suppresses its own people and which seeks and has expressed the desire to do so around the world. Thank you.
I just deal briefly with 2 points about my own discourse which emerged from Douglas Murray. And I think you should bear this in mind too, because I think in a matter of what is going on with Iran's nuclear threat or otherwise, we do need to speak as precisely and as carefully as we should. And twice in that peroration of Mr. Bai, he misrepresented what I'd said, and I think we should bear that in mind. It's happy to misrepresent what I say, I can misrepresent the situation in Iraq. He said, for instance, that my threshold of unacceptability, as he said, was that we would discover that Iran had a bomb. I said, I was actually answering the question from the gentleman over there. He asked me, what would change my mind? And I said, well, if we discovered they had a nuclear program, of course they had a bomb. So you misrepresented me there. And I think that is important. I think when you come to weigh your votes in a moment or two, bear in mind, he's been happy to misrepresent what I said. He also misrepresented me what we said in our book about these threats from Britain, about these threats against Iran. We said that all we were pointing out, we weren't advocating, we were pointing out that by making military threats against Iran, and you can see it on page 92, you're quite right, we were in breach of the UN Charter, which says that all UN member states shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. There is little question that all three should be expelled from the UN under Article 6 of the Charter.
Wow.
No, I wasn't saying that. I was just stating that's what the Charter says. We weren't making any, we just explained it. Anyway, that's the second one. Third one, I do think that you should accept that we have also been guilty. Your giggling reminds me very much of Daily Mail conference. All days have been brought back, Melanie. But the bad faith has not just been shown, I accept it's been shown, by the way, by Iran, it's been shown by us too. You must look at the section in the book dealing with 2005 negotiations, when we suddenly changed our mind about Iran's right to nuclear enrichment. We certainly made that a basis of our negotiations under instructions from Washington that they couldn't go for nuclear enrichment. That was the sine qua non of none of our negotiations. If that remains our basis, there is no possible deal, and it can't happen. What you've had from Douglas Murray tonight, by the way, and I hope you've picked this up, is there are sensible people, the intelligence community, the military men. They all say, Benny Gantz, the Israeli chief of staff, Ehud Barak, the defense minister, James Clapper, they all say there isn't an Israeli nuclear threat at the moment. There might be one, we accept that. But then you get the Netanyahus, the nutters, the politicians. And he is voicing the extremist talk from the politician. I want to align myself with the national intelligence estimates, with the people who understand the military situation. I want to say that there is no evidence at the moment that Iran is pursuing a nuclear bomb. Now that means that we do have, with Mr. Rahman, a most wonderful opportunity a wonderful, we've had that opportunity. Labour this guy because he wants to regime change. Douglas Murray wants regime change in Iran. I'm happy to do basis with legitimate, I hope that we will treat Iran as it is, as a sensible, legitimate state, bring them back into the international community, create situations like all the things you value so much, human rights, sensitive public language, respect for Israel, all these things will come back. Now, what I'm saying is we get it right, we talk to them seriously, we deal with them. It's not just about nuclear, by the way. There's a comprehensive settlement to be done with Iran. We don't want to go to war. What Douglas Murray is doing is a rhetoric and a language which takes us to war. So what I say is we do have a most wonderful opportunity for peace, historic peace. So long as we say goodbye to the dangerous delusion that Iran is an irrational state hell-bent on the acquisition of nuclear weapons. So long as we say goodbye to the rhetoric of my friend and colleague from the Spectator, Mr. Douglas Murray.
Great, so now we have the our gimmick. So those who are in favour of the proposition that Iran is the Iranian threat a dangerous delusion, please raise your hands. And those against?
Well, exactly the same.
Very close. Well done. Well, thank you, our speakers very, very much indeed for coming to what I think you agree was a fairly good-humoured and at times generous discussion. But it was more informative, I think, than entertaining, which was the idea. And thank you all very much for coming too. I'll now turn over to the brilliant editor and director of the CPS, Tim Hart.
Adam, thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much to both Douglas and Peter. And I owe them both huge apologies, as I had to slip away after the first opening remarks. I did that because there was another event going on this evening, which was the Think Tank Awards put on by Prospect magazine, and I'm delighted to say that one of our publications was awarded Publication of the Year. It's a brilliant pamphlet by Andrew Chirey and Peter on the Justice and Security Bill. But I hope that through your contributions may be very late for the awards. I actually missed the president, but I'd like to say that we came away with a very well-good prize. Thank you very much indeed for coming.